With this, we're going to start talking about adaptive immunity. And I want to compare adaptive and innate immunity first. So the immune responses, as you remember, can be separated into innate, the ones that we discussed in a separate video, and adaptive. So innate responses are usually faster, since they do not require pre-exposure to the pathogen. No pre-exposure to the pathogen. However, they are relatively local. Inflammatory response is an example of it. They're also not very effective. Now, what about adaptive responses? Let's separate this. What about adaptive responses? They're slower, since they require pre-exposure. They're also systemic, meaning that they affect multiple parts of the body. And on top of that, they are more effective. And importantly, they form immunological memory. So to form the adaptive immune response, the key thing is to expose your T and B lymphocytes to the antigen. And this is what I want to highlight about the antigen. So imagine this is the antigen. On the antigen you can have several antigenic determinants. Okay? So those are antigenic determinants. These antigenic determinants will be recognized by the various antibodies. For instance, this one will be recognized by a single antibody. This will be recognized by a specific antibody. And this one will be recognized by a specific antibody. So these antigenic determinants essentially what triggers the adaptive immune response. I mentioned in the lecture what can be an antigen. Antigen is a foreign molecule, large, complex molecule such as protein, nucleic acid, or carbohydrate. But I really want you to get down with the antigenic determinants right here. So now let's say a few words about the cells of adaptive immune system. So those are lymphocytes, and they originate in bone marrow. So we have T and B lymphocytes. They originate in the bone marrow. Then, from the bone marrow, B cells mature in bone marrow, while T cells, they mature in thymus. And then both B and T cells populate lymphoid tissue, such as spleen or lymph nodes. And in the lymphoid tissue they get exposed to the antigen. So that's antigen exposure. And once they are exposed to the antigen, they enter the circulation and they start mounting the immune response. Now, the main mechanisms, these two types of cells, are for B cells. B cells produce plasma cells and memory cells. Well, memory cells, obviously, they keep immunological memory, allowing you to respond to the same kind of infection more efficiently later. And plasma cells produce antibodies. We're going to talk about these mechanisms a little bit more in detail in subsequent videos, but a few words about T cells. So T cells, they differentiate into two main types of effector cells. We have CD4 cells and CD8 cells. So CD4 cells, they can become, well, memory cells, T helper, and T regulatory. In CD8 cells, they become cytotoxic lymphocytes, also known as T killer cells. So that is kind of a summary of the general activities of B and T cells, and we're going to talk about these mechanisms a bit later.